Welcome, friends, to this workshop on designating a religious venue as an LGBTQ+ historical site with historian Heather White and preservationist Jay Shockley. I'm Mark Bowman, Executive Director of the LGBTQ Religious Archives Network, the host of today's program. LGBTQ RAN is a unique venture dedicated to preserving the history of LGBTQ religious movements around the world. LGBTQ RAN is a digital enterprise. We are not a physical repository that stores papers. We advise and support leaders and groups in their efforts to preserve their records in appropriate archives. Furthermore, we collect and provide a treasure of historical information on our website about LGBTQ+ persons and groups from a wide array of religious expressions around the world. And finally, we encourage research and scholarship in queer religious history. Today, we are pleased to present an interactive discussion about how religious venues can be designated as LGBTQ+ historical sites. Progressive faith communities have been a vital source of support for queer communities, and this involvement is key to understanding LGBTQ history as a whole, in addition to LGBTQ religious history. Historian Heather White, PhD, and Jay Shockley, Project Director of the New York City LGBTQ Historic Sites Project, will provide useful information on different efforts nationally, statewide, and locally to identify places as LGBTQ+ historical sites. They will outline steps that religious groups can take to document their history and to request recognition as a historical site. They also want to respond to your particular questions and comments. Brief intros. Jay Shockley, an architectural historian and preservationist, was employed by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission between 1979 and 2015. As the senior historian in the research department, Jay researched and wrote more than 100 reports covering all aspects of the city's architectural and social cultural history. He is a founder and co-director of the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project, started in 2015. Heather White, PhD, is a visiting assistant professor at the University of Puget Sound, teaching in gender, queer, and feminist studies. Heather is author of Reforming Sodom, Protestants and the Rise of Gay Rights, 2015, from University of North Carolina Press, and co-editor with Bethany Morton and Gillian Frank of Devotions and Desires, Histories of Sexuality and Religion in the 20th Century United States. Unlike our previous webinars, this workshop is a Zoom meeting where we can all see and hear each other on screen. So this is intended to be a learning experience for each of you. So we invite your participation by submitting your questions or comments in the chat box. Please do stay muted during Jay's and Heather's opening presentations. Then feel free to speak up when you are invited to do so in the discussion that will follow. Finally, please direct any technical concerns to Riot Mueller, who is the tech manager for this program. Now, I am pleased to welcome first Jay Shockley and then Heather White to talk about designating a religious venue as an LGBTQ+ historic site.
Okay, thank you, Mark, and welcome everybody. Again, my name is Jay Shockley. I'm one of the founders and co-directors of the NYC LGBT Historic Sites Project. And what I'm going to do is to go through the various levels that are possible for recognition of any properties in the United States and touch on what LGBT historic sites have been recognized in the United States The overarching thing is that the intersection between historic preservation and the LGBTQ community is relatively recent for a variety of reasons. Starting out with the fact that our community has had so many other issues to face over the decades. And I think in a lot of ways, even though historic preservation is professionally, there are a lot of LGBTQ people in the field. People were hesitant to ask for any sort of official recognition. So again, it's been relatively recent as a concept. And actually our project, as you'll see, was literally one of the founders in even conceiving that we were a minority community that was worthy of recognition. Okay, briefly about our project, as Mark indicated, we were founded in 2015. The three of us that were co-founders had been working in this area ever since 1993, and we eventually kicked the can down the road, but we started this project in 2015. Our main manifestation were a social, cultural, historic initiative. The main manifestation is this website, which I'll give you the, at the very end of my presentation, you'll see what the website is. So again, this is, when you go onto our website, this is the first image you'll see. Our project covers the ground from the 17th century up to the year 2000, which we had to have a cutoff date. It covers the 5 boroughs of New York City. And on the right-hand side, you see the color coding is building or site types. We currently have 447 sites active on our website. When you click on each one of those boxes, you'll get a little pop-up box that says what the site is. Then if you click on that box, then you'll get a full page, which has a lot of histories, historic images, active videos if we found them, or podcasts relating to the site. Somehow okay. Also, as a slightly easier way for people, if they haven't been on our website before, we currently have 35 themes up that cover a huge range of topics, as you can see here, everything from the Harlem Renaissance to transgender to women's coffee houses from the 70s, and on and on and on. So in many ways, it's easier to approach our subject matter, because again, as historic preservationists, all of the sites that we have are extant. Since we founded in 2015, we've only lost 3 buildings through demolition. And New York is very fortunate in that way. The Landmarks Commission was founded in 1965. So, and New York has one of the strongest historic preservation laws. So many of these sites have been preserved through historic district status or whatever other mechanisms, but it's only been very recently that any of the LGBTQ history is recognized within those designations. So the first level of official recognition in the United States is local landmark designation. And this is only possible if the city or town or county or some other local entity has a local landmarks law. In many ways, this is the single most important level of recognition, because the other levels that I'm going to discuss later do not protect from demolition or severe alteration or whatever. So it's only if a local designation happens and the local law is strong enough to prevent demolition and alteration, this is possible. So this is the example of New York City. All of these sites were advocated by our project. And as you can see, Stonewall was the first one. When I was still on staff before I retired, I had been trying for years to get the commission to recognize Stonewall, and they were 1000% resistant, in part because Stonewall is in the Greenwich Village Historic District. And they said that, well, we don't designate individual buildings in historic districts. But my argument always was that an alteration permit could come into a staff member who had no knowledge of the importance of Stonewall, and it could have been altered beyond recognition on a staff level permit. So the commission, right before its federal recognition, swooped in and finally designated after years of me personally advocating. So in recent years, like a lot of other places that are not homophobic, between 2019 and last year, they've recognized a number of other individual landmarks. All of these were advocated by our project again. And as you'll see on my next slide, the city largely recognized them because we had gotten them recognized federally. Audre Lorde, her house in Staten Island, she was an important Black lesbian feminist and poet. Cafe Chino was the birthplace of Off Broadway for 10 years, from 58 to 68, and was also literally the birthplace of the concept of gay theater in that period when it actually was illegal to depict gay people on the stage in New York. The LGBT Community Center has been the main community center for New York City since 1984. James Baldwin, obviously important Black writer and activist. Women's Liberation Center was one of the most important meeting places for feminists and lesbians in the 1970s. The Gay Activist Alliance Firehouse was the single most important community center in New York City from 1971 to 1974. It was the Gay Activist Alliance was the second post-Stonewall group founded in New York City and was the leading group in New York in those years. Lesbian Her Story Archives is one of the leading lesbian archives in the world in this row house in Brooklyn. And Julius's Bar was the site of what our project has dubbed the first planned significant pre-Stonewall Civil Rights Act in 1966, which became known as the Sip-In at Julius's, which put a spotlight on the discrimination against gay people in bars. So all of these have been accomplished by our project since we were founded in 2015. An important thing to point out, and I'm sure we'll have a discussion of this in the question and answers later, what enabled us to actually start our project in 2015 is at exactly the same time when we decided we wanted to do something. The National Park Service, which is the entity within the Department of the Interior that runs the National Register of Historic Places, they started a new funding source called the Underrepresented Communities Fund. And this is an annual funding source. And we've been very lucky and actually have become the poster child for that fund. We've gotten funding from them every single year. So it's enabled us to put all of these properties on the National Register of Historic Places. The National Register is very important because it is the basic national recognition of significant properties in the entire United States and territories. But the dirty secret is that it is honorary only. It doesn't have any obligations for the property owners, so it really does not prevent severe alteration or demolition, except under a few limitations. If there's state or federal funding that would impact a listed property, then the federal government would swing in and try to have mitigating measures. There are currently over 96,000 properties listed on the National Register, which was founded in 1966. But the LGBTQ community is the most underrepresented community in the United States. Our project is the only one keeping track of our community's properties listed, and currently there are only 29 properties listed out of 96,000 plus properties on the National Register. And of that 29, our project has done virtually a third of those. Again, of the projects that I didn't mention, they're city landmarks. This was the second one from the top on the left is Bayard Rustin's residence, important civil rights leader who planned the March on Washington in 1963. He was kept in the background behind Martin Luther King because he was openly gay. His partner still actually lives in their apartment. Two over, the Alice Austin House. She was a pioneering woman photographer at the end of the 19th century. She and her partner lived in this house for over 50 years. Cafe Chino, again, is, as I mentioned, the birthplace of Off Broadway. Earl Hall was the site at Columbia University that was the first homophile group in the United States that was formed prior to Stonewall. Church of the Holy Apostles, I'll get to in a bit. Lorraine Hansberry, who was semi-closeted for most of her life, and is most famous as the first Black female playwright on Broadway for The Raisin in the Sun. But this was the first of her two residences in Greenwich Village. Lillian Wald was a lesbian settlement house worker. Turns out when we did the National Register nomination for that, virtually the entire settlement house was a late 19th century homosocial world of women, many of them lesbians, that were just such an important force in the immigrant community on the Lower East Side in New York. The Jaffe Theater we'll be doing next year. We just got our latest National Park Service grant, and that has an unbelievable richness of layers of history. It started out as a Yiddish theater. Then for about a decade, it had New York City's most famous drag club in the basement of the building. In the 50s, it became the first really important off-Broadway theater. And when they turned the front of the building into apartments, it housed Peter Hujar, David Wojnarowicz, and Jackie Curtis, who was a Warhol actor. So the one other thing I'd want to point out while we're talking about the National Register, right at the time they started the new funding for underrepresented communities, and we started having a success with listing properties on the National Register, they allowed for the very first time to allow cultural historic amendments to pre-existing nominations to the National Register. So our project has been saying since the 90s that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of properties already on the National Register that are important to LGBTQ history, but there's no documentation. So there are many churches that are listed for their architecture that are on the National Register. If the congregation wants to point out their significant LGBTQ history, then this amendment is a possibility, and the congregations can apply for underrepresented communities funding. So the very first LGBT property listed on the National Register was the Stonewall in 1999. Again, the three of us back in 1993, we had met through this other project, and we attempted to get Stonewall recognized in 1993 for the 25th anniversary of Stonewall. It did not happen then for two very important reasons. Nobody, since 1966, when the National Register was created, nobody had ever approached the National Park Service to recognize an LGBT property for its history. So they really did not know what to do with our request. We got a 12-page letter that is very perplexing to read, but it was quite clear that it wasn't going to happen because they didn't know what to do, and they really didn't think there was any context, any scholarship out there. Why should the gay community be recognized, particularly for a rebellion? But 5 years later, an LGBT employees group had been formed in the Department of the Interior in DC, And while Clinton was still in office, they wanted something to happen in terms of the National Register. They actually found our file in their files, and they approached us, and with the assistance of John Barry, who at the time was an openly gay undersecretary of the Department of the Interior, the listing was able to happen. The second problem in 1993 was to be listed on the National Register, you need the consent of the owner, and the family that owned the Stonewall building had no interest in any way, shape, or form in complying with that. So those were the two reasons that it could not happen in 93. In 1999, when Andrew Delcart, who's another co-founder of my project, and I became the co-author of the nomination, to be listed on the National Register nationally, it has to be listed on the state register of the state in which the property is located. And luckily, there was a very cooperative group of women in Albany that came up with a solution to the ownership, which was, if you list all the streets and the park across the street from Stonewall as the site of it, and they literally modeled this concept after Civil War battlefields, that 50% of the ownership of the site, of the Stonewall site, was not the owners of the building, but it was the city of New York because of the street beds and the park. So those were the two reasons that it was able to go forward. And the following year, which is quite unusual given the significance of Stonewall, it was fast-tracked to become a National Historic Landmark, which is the next federal recognition. That's a rarefied group of properties on the National Register. I'll also point out there are many criteria listed within nominating a property to the National Register, and Stonewall also had to meet that hurdle because basically the cutoff is it has to be 50 years of significance prior to the listing date. So clearly in 1995, that would have made 1949. You know, what I'm saying is that Stonewall happened in 69, and 50 years after that was not 1999. So we had to prove that it was of extraordinary significance to have it listed on the National Register and then become a National Historic Landmark. So in 2016, Stonewall achieved an even higher recognition, which it became the first and only national monument. I forgot to mention for Stonewall, when we listed it in 1999, it was the only property listed for LGBTQ history for the next 13 years. It just stood by itself, and it took a long time for the rest of the country to start catching up. So when the monument was designated by Obama in 2016 as a national monument, that only was able to happen because we had done all the research and set the boundaries with the street bed and Christopher Park as the site. So the Stonewall is in the national monument boundaries that we determined for the register and for the National Historic Landmark. But to become a national monument, the federal government has to own a piece of property. So what ended up happening was Christopher Park, which you're seeing on the screen, which is directly across the street from the Stonewall, and was very significant because a lot of the kids that created the rebellion, the 6 Knights of Stonewall, hung out in this park. The city of New York ceded the property, so the federal government now owns Christopher Park. So Christopher Park, the federally owned monument, actually is the park. It has nothing to do with ownership of the building, which is still in private hands. So very quickly, while we're on the topic of the National Register, there are only 4 churches in the United States that are currently listed for their LGBT history. The earliest one in 2017 was the First Unitarian Society of Denver, and it was listed basically, from what I could find, for 3 basic reasons. It was the site of the first same-sex wedding in Colorado in 1975. The MCC Church met here between 1973 and 1979, and the Denver Gay Coalition met here in the church. The second property listed, which we did our project listed, and again, this was an amendment because this is an old significant church in Manhattan, and it had been listed in the early 70s, a very brief, very primitive listing. So we actually had to totally rewrite it and have a whole section on the importance of the architecture and the architect. This is when I first met Heather White, because she had participated in this congregation and had written some articles and had done a bunch of research on it. So we collaborated in making this listing happen. And basically, it's incredibly important in gay rights in New York City, because between 1969 and 1974, it really was New York City's first community center for the community. And GAA met there, Gay Liberation Front met there, a bunch of other groups, a bunch of other startup organizations were there. And very importantly, it was the home for, besides the Episcopal congregation that was the permanent meeting house for, there were 3 religious congregations that were either founded there or met there during those years. And it included also the first significant Jewish congregation in the United States. The following 2 were also the same year, listed in 2020. Trinity Episcopal Church, which wonderfully has a site marker out in front of it, in St. Louis. From 1969 to 1993, the congregation actively supported gay rights, and they're considered fairly early in the United States as the congregation exhibiting a compassionate response to the AIDS crisis. And then the last of the 4 congregations is All Souls Church Unitarian in Washington, D.C. From the 60s through the 90s, they actively embraced the LGBTQ community and are considered the first religious congregation in Washington advocating for marriage equality. So there is our website. All of the sites that I've discussed in New York City are on our website with a lot of history and images. And we also have a very active social media presence. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am about to share my screen, and I'm going to double check. Give me a thumbs up if you can actually see it. Nice. There's a bunch of familiar names and faces here. Hi, Rick Landman, who was important when I was beginning my research on Holy Apostles as a member of CBST. Nice. And Greg, I see your correction that the first LGBTQ synagogue was a House of David and Jonathan, founded in Brooklyn. And then, okay, you can see that note there about the history of gay synagogues. So what I'm going to do in my presentation is talk to you a little bit about how to go about researching your congregation or religious group's queer history. And when I first started this, one key resource for me was the Studying Congregations Guide, which has a lot on that website about how to investigate both the contemporary and historical context for a congregation, and a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily think. So there was a lot in there that helped me think about not only what was happening in the sort of directly faith-based aspects of a congregation, but also things about how looking at a building and looking at a neighborhood and looking at the context just surrounding a congregation provides a lot of information about the contextual history of that faith community. So what I have done here is I've put together the sources that have been useful for me in understanding the history of the Church of the Holy Apostles, and particularly the queer history of the Church of the Holy Apostles. The comments that I'm offering, because they're specific to Holy Apostles, I'll answer some questions as you have them about how to moderate this approach to other kinds of congregations and other kinds of faith communities. Okay, I'm also always figuring out how, there we are, press play and it goes. My work, you can see the book there, Reforming Sodom. No, here, and I'm also gonna put this, try again. There we are. Okay, the book there, Reforming Sodom. And I'll say one of the things that I found out in the course of this research, which began as a PhD dissertation, was that in most communities in the US, in most cities and most towns, the first gay community center effectively was a church. Because progressive, it tended to be Protestant congregations, very frequently provided meeting space for homophile and then later gay, lesbian, trans, LGBT, etc. congregations. So finding out that piece of information was also important for me for finding out more about Holy Apostles. I actually found out about Holy Apostles by interviewing Reverend Roy Burchard, who is a minister in the United Church of Christ and also one of the founders of the Metropolitan Community Church of New York City. And he mentioned Holy Apostles as the parish hall where all of the gay groups were meeting. And that was my impetus to begin to find out more about that congregation and what its significance was to the gay liberation movement that we all know so well about because of the notoriety, the fame, the iconic aspect of the Stonewall riots. So I am currently working on a book project about the church that hosted gay liberation. And I also have an ongoing interest in church buildings and religious communities as LGBT community centers. So how would you go about researching this history for a faith community? One key source for me, the most important first source, was oral history interviews, just talking to people. And current and former participants in a faith community, current and former participants in an LGBT religious group, such as some of the advocacy groups within denominations and faith communities, and then also participants in LGBT community groups, which might have been meeting or might have known of that faith community. So the kinds of questions that I've asked is just to find out more about religious groups in a given city. I was asking these kinds of questions when I was in Boston last year to find out more, because without a knowledge of the LGBT community in Boston, I wasn't sure, like, were there any religious groups that were important early supporters? And there are several of them. And in fact, some of them that hosted some of the earliest homophile and gay liberation era organizations. I was also really interested in finding out about how the meeting sites and congregations providing meeting places sort of percolated up and had a transformational effect on congregations and led to larger public debates within denominations and larger religious institutions about LGBT inclusion. And one place to start with that kind of inquiry is to ask about the ground rules for using space. So when a religious group says, yes, Gay Liberation Front, you can meet for your general meetings every Sunday night, were there any ground rules? Were there any discussions within that group among the Gay Liberation Front, for example, about what it meant to meet in a church? So questions about the space are good to get at that very material, concrete level. Another really important source has been the archived records of a given congregation. And I mean, think for a minute, if you've been a participant in a faith community, where would those records be? Sometimes they're hard to find. They might be in an attic, they might be in a basement, they might be in someone's closet. And I'll also give a plug here. LGBT RAN regularly offers workshops on how to archive your own records of LGBT religious history. So that's a good thing to pay attention to if you happen to have those kinds of records. Finding those records are helpful for learning out more about the longer history of a congregation's involvement in LGBTQ inclusion. The next place to go above a congregation is other kinds of centralized institutional records. So in the case of Holy Apostles, the diocesan archives of the Episcopal Diocese of New York. There are also, so whatever that jurisdiction is, onward to sometimes national denominational headquarters. And that's particularly important for finding out how local controversy or local questions about LGBT inclusion might have percolated upward. Are there discussions between the clergy and other officials in the denomination about the handling of that congregation of their LGBTQ inclusion? Are there records or other kinds of correspondence there? That's okay. And then another source is, of course, the digitized records of LGBTQ groups. Hold on one sec, I need to go back. There we are. Okay. So another important set of sources are the archive records of LGBT groups. So not necessarily digitized, and those are often in LGBT community-based archives. There are also LGBTQ collections at other institutions, public libraries, universities, and state and local archives. LGBT RAN has a great listing of how to find records of particular faith-based LGBT groups. And one of the things that I've looked at as I've looked at LGBT community-based archives is groups like the Gay Activist Alliance or the Gay Liberation Front, which didn't have a religious affiliation, so wouldn't have been listed in LGBT RAN, but did meet in congregations. So finding out where these groups met was important for finding their relationships with congregations and churches in particular, who also went on to become important welcoming congregations. One exciting thing that was really important in my work was finding digitized records of many of those LGBT groups. There is a digital repository called the Archive of Sexuality and Gender, and it is often at universities and some public libraries, such as the New York Public Library. And it has this astonishing collection of like millions probably of documents, but collections of some of the largest groups across the US and even internationally, that has a keyword searchable database. So I was even able to go in and do things like, once I knew the place, the congregation that had an important meeting place, I wanted to see if there was more that I could find about it. I could put in a keyword search for a street address, or for the name of that religious groups, or for the name of a clergy person who was at that congregation. So this digitized set of digitized records has been really important for finding those needle in a haystack kind of searches. There are lots of other digitized records on the web as well, in addition to the archives of sexuality and gender. Internet and social media is, of course, an important way to do this research as well. And I actually found the LGBT Religious Archive Network back in 2004 by doing an internet search to find out more about LGBT religious history. And all kinds of things can then be part of the research once you're able to find just some of those sources. I do keyword searches. Social media has been important for finding and contacting people involved in these congregations and the groups that met there, which then allowed me to do oral history interviews and find out more about their experiences. And then I've also found that local newspapers and other community records have been important as well. The Chelsea Clinton News, which has nothing to do with Bill and Hillary's daughter, has been important for finding out about Holy Apostles. There's quite a lot of articles in that newspaper about Holy Apostles in the 60s and 70s, and that has helped fill in the contextual information about that congregation. I've also found that contextual information is helpful and looking at other local community organizations in the immediate neighborhood of that church to find out more about how they interacted with community groups. And then, of course, academic and other published sources are also some of the easiest often to find, but also an important source of that historical information. And I've listed here a partial set of resources. And there are many other things, but I didn't want to overwhelm people. One thing that I wanted to make sure you saw there, because it was important as I was getting started, this book by Keith Hartman, which is a history of LGBT organizing in my hometown of Raleigh, North Carolina. And one of the things that it showed was how important faith communities were to the emergence of LGBT inclusivity in Raleigh, the Triangle area, and the state of North Carolina. So there again, congregations are often more important than you might think, not only to the history of particular faith communities, but also to the broader history of LGBT diversity and inclusion, and the political struggle for inclusion more broadly. And finding that history and being able to spotlight it is important, particularly because so much of the national politics around LGBT inclusion presents religion as the sort of the source of resistance and the enemy to LGBT rights. So being able to have a record of the faith-based involvement in this history is really important. And I'll say just one more thing. So we're going to open up in just a minute to questions. I've learned tons from Jay Shockley about how to understand historical registry and what landmarking is and how it works. I knew very little, if anything, about the process before we collaborated on the on Holy Apostles. So getting that recognition as a historical site is important. There are also many reasons to research your congregation's queer history beyond that official recognition. Being able to understand how it was, what was the pathway for a particular congregation to becoming welcoming, being able to see the struggles that were often part of the story early on, and being able to sort of honor the painful parts of that history as well is really important. And then I'll also say, when I hear, so back to the National Registry, when I hear that only 4 churches are recognized as part of LGBT history, I know there are so many more. And it is just important to invest in making sure that I'm seeing folks list things already. It's just so important to bring visibility to that history. So thank you. And we are going to open it up to questions now. Mark, I'm gonna facilitate. One of the things I would say is I'd like to start with questions. I'm seeing a lot of stories and comments in the chat, and those are important too, but I also want to make sure that if there's confusion or if there are particular questions based on the presentations, I want to make sure that we get to those first. Excellent. So I am scanning through, and I see there were some questions about San Francisco. I think Jay could probably answer some questions about that. San Francisco and Glide Memorial Church is currently not listed, as I understand, for its LGBT significance. Is that right?
Yes, the only thing that I can provide is that our project is friends with Shane Watson, who's one of the leading preservationists for the LGBTQ community in San Francisco. And I know that Glide started in the process, and I'm not quite sure what held it up, but the thing that I didn't say in my presentation, this obviously is not the case in San Francisco, but as I indicated, to be listed on the National Register, you have to go through the state preservation office first. And clearly, in a really tortured world right now, with so many attacks on our community and so many homophobic legislatures, that's obviously a real problem. That's not the problem in California. And again, I'm not quite sure what has held up their listing, but I know for a fact that Glide Memorial was started in the process.
Cool. I'm working through the chat real quick. Mark, I also see some hands up, so 1 second. River Sims have mentioned about Polk Street needing to be recognized, definitely. So, and Greg Drinkwater with some information about the earliest LGBT synagogues. Rick, who I know about the history of Congregation Beit Simchat Torah.
And I'm sorry, thank you for correcting the factual thing. The House of Jonathan David is on our website in Brooklyn. I should have said that it was the first congregation that had a lasting congregation.
And I see Ron's comment about, I hope that there are some helpful things here in this presentation for that effort in particular. Let's see. Okay. There's probably more things here. I think I'm caught up, but Caleb, I see your hand.
Thanks. Technical question for Jay. So if a place that is interested in this is currently in a historic district recognized by New York City, if I understand you correctly, it would have to then get recognized by the state, and then it can apply for the national.
No, the local designation has nothing to do with the National Register. In the case of New York City, the Landmarks Commission got, I shouldn't say shamed into it, but when they indicated a willingness to finally recognize LGBTQ history, the properties that they ended up designating locally were properties that we had already got listed on the National Register by and large. So a lot of the history was already researched. And ironically enough, all those years when I was still working, when I was the lone voice advocating that if anything is going to happen in New York City, it's got to start out with Stonewall. And I was literally stonewalled because it was already in a historic district. Ironically enough, those people don't even know this is the real weeds of preservation. The Greenwich Village Historic District was designated in April of 1969. So when Stonewall happened, it was already in a historic district. So, you know, when they finally recognized that Stonewall was about to become a national monument and they had not recognized it locally, they got shamed into finally designating it locally, which is really, really important because half of it is now about to become the National Visitor Center, the right-hand part of the original building. You know, the Stonewall bar that's in the left-hand side of the Stonewall original building has nothing to do with the 1969 Stonewall bar. It's a recent incursion. Not 1 square inch of the inside of that bar was there when Stonewall happened in 1969. So every time the owners or any of the tenants or anything proposed changes to the Stonewall building, they have to go through the Landmarks Preservation Commission. Again, the National Register is totally separate. It does have to go through the state. And, you know, you need the support of if it's going to be a religious property, you need 100% support from the head of the congregation. I didn't mention, we had a slew of different things that we were proposing to do on the National Register in our project to represent outer borough properties, more properties of communities of color, and the owners were just not interested. When PFLAG was founded by the Manford family, the first slide that I had, which is now the Church of the Village, which was then Metropolitan Dwayne United Methodist Church, the family sold their house in Flushing, Queens, and we really wanted to put that on National Register because that's where the family was that had founded PFLAG, and Their son became a really important early gay rights leader. The current owners of that property literally did not want to be known as, quote, the gay house in Queens. There is still so much misinformation and so much homophobia out there. And most of the significant properties that should be listed on the National Register are not in the ownership of LGBTQ owners. So that's a huge problem. Just another example, we wanted to list Billy Strayhorn's house in Harlem, and the current owners didn't want to be known as a gay connected property in Harlem. So it's a huge problem. And local politics for local designations are parallel and as equally important as they are for national listings, but you need a supportive state historic preservation office. You absolutely need the consent of the ownership.
Okay, so very basic question, forgive me. So the LGBTQ plus certification is through the National Register.
That's the federal listing, yes.
Okay, great, cool. And all right, that makes sense. That was my question.
And I think I want to also note there that, Caleb, am I right that St. Peter's is a congregation that you're researching? Yeah,
yes.
Like this is an important connection between you and Jay, because that would be another site.
Sorry, this is St. Peter's in Chelsea?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you know it, Jay?
Well, I live at 14th and 8th Avenue, so yes. That's also, if I'm not mistaken, important theater center, so.
Yeah, and civil rights. A lot of stuff going on.
Let's see, and
well, it's actually,
Holly Newman.
Sorry, just very personal
Sure,
thing.
sure.
We don't have St. Peter's on our website yet.
Oh.
So please contact us if you're willing to write up a draft.
Yeah, I'll talk to the vestry.
I love it. A question from Holly: when pursuing historic designation of a church or religious site, how does permission work? And that was, Carly had a question similar to that too. Wondering what perspective has dominance if the local congregation approves, but the national denomination disagrees. Ooh, I don't know that the national denomination would necessarily have jurisdiction. There's already, for example, a Methodist church, Foundry Methodist, is it, what was it? Oh, there isn't. Holly, could you say more about the denomination? Are you willing to name that?
It isn't a specific one that I know for sure that that's
Okay.
the perspective, but it's one that I suspect could come up with a former church that I was part of in Omaha. And it's something where I could see this being very interesting for that congregation to pursue, but also that there would be potential opposition with kind of statewide and denomination-wide disagreements over this.
That's a really interesting question. I mean, when we did Holy Apostles, we only dealt with the current congregation of that. It had nothing to do, I mean, I have no idea if they had internal discussions with the Episcopal hierarchy in New York, but you only need the consent of the congregation itself. But as you well know, in the current climate of the United States, internal religious politics are their own separate thing. So
yeah, I know like some denominations, it's very basically each congregation is kind of just seen as its own independent body with kind of a loose federation, but then other things like, I believe the Catholic Church, I'm not 100% sure, like all of the property is seen as owned by the larger Catholic Church, not by the local parish. So yeah, I was just wondering if anybody had come up against that yet.
It would be really interesting to find out. I mean, the other thing is that there's sort of when something isn't yet forbidden or there's an interesting window of opportunity. Yeah, so for Catholic, and I'm also thinking about some United Methodist possible congregations and others that have a larger struggle. This could be really interesting.
yeah, I mean, in New York alone, which parallels many larger cities where the Catholic Church has way too many properties and they're trying to sell them all for private development or demolition. It's an enormous, enormous struggle for the dwindling part of the remaining congregation that wants to save the church and have it recognized historically so it can prevent demolition. There have been a few successes in New York, but it's a very huge problem.
I'm going to jump in, and Charles has a question to talk about the money of producing at local level designation and National Register. So is there anything to be said about the cost of going through the national landmark process or the historical designation process?
Well, I can attest to two different things. In New York City, for instance, if the commission can get interested in pursuing local designation of a property, ultimately there's zero cost because the research staff of the commission will do the research and write up the report. Obviously, anything that can be provided to spur along that process is incredibly helpful, as I know from 35 years of writing reports. The National Register is the same thing. The interest in doing a nomination can come from anybody or from anywhere. There's no mystery to how it can start. And if somebody has somebody in their congregation like Heather that's good at doing research and good at doing writing, anybody can do the nomination. That said, most of the nominations come through professional historians and architectural historians who, there's a whole subgenre of people who make their living writing National Register nominations. Andrew Dolkart, who's one of our project's co-founders, he's still a professor at Columbia, but his bread and butter work prior to that was writing National Register nominations. And as I've mentioned multiple times, the underrepresented communities funding, a lot of their funding every year is specifically to hire people to do National Register nominations. You have to have a specific property that you want to do that. And to get the grant, you're going to have the ducks in a row that you have the owner's permission and so on. I think the going rate in terms of their funding is approximately $25,000 per nomination. Wow. That doesn't mean that if a congregation goes out looking for somebody that's up to the task to do it, that it would cost that. But just to give it, for instance, I mean, the next nomination we're doing that our project's doing, that Yiddish theater, I'm writing the nomination and we got a $25,000 grant just for that one nomination.
And so I'll jump in. Oh.
So again, if there is somebody in the congregation that's up to the task and they're willing to do it for free, there's no cost at all. But again, you need to get through the State Preservation Office permission to be able to go forward with the project. And you really need to hone down on why this is important, either nationally significant or at least very important to the state in which the property is located. It really can't be something that's just totally local with no broader significance.
I'll jump in, and we're a little bit after noon, so I know that we need to wrap this up. No one needs to feel like they're being held hostage here, but I also wanted to invite, so if anyone wants to hang around for a few minutes with particular questions, I welcome that. But let me pass this over to Mark Bowman for a moment for just a few words as we leave.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Heather and Jay, for this fascinating discussion. Heather particularly suggested this topic. It was sort of new to me to think about how to do this. And so I'm hoping some of you have approached, what is LGBTQ RAN doing around this designating of historic sites? Frankly, we only have the resources to help you. So the sort of things that Heather and Jay have talked about, you are things you can work on locally, and Heather and Jay and others are available to assist you as needed. Thank you so much, Heather and Jay, for these illuminating presentations and for beginning, which I think is a lot more discussion and the work that we can do together. Thank all of you who were here offered comments and questions. Within a few days, you will receive an email with a link to the recording of today's program that you can share with friends and colleagues. If you're interested in more opportunities to explore the history of queer religious movements, please check out the LGBTQ website, particularly our events page. There you will find announcements of future online programs, as well as recordings of past presentations. Our next webinars in September are also going to be hands-on training on how you or your group can preserve their history in records and papers, led by LGBTQ activist Doris Malkmus. A workshop on September 12th, Archiving Historical Records. We'll be talking about dealing with old papers and records that Heather mentioned, and how it is that you get those preserved in appropriate repositories. Then on September 14th, Doris will be talking about maintaining digital records, sort of current and ongoing records. How do you organize and maintain those so they're prepared for preservation in the future? Watch those on our website. In closing, I simply remind you that LGBTQ is the first and foremost source of information on LGBTQ+ religious history. We are a very small operation that is funded through the generosity of friends like you. So if you would like to see more programs like this one, and if you share our commitment to ensure that our voices and stories are preserved for future generations, please help make this happen with your gift. On behalf of everyone here, I offer again much gratitude to Heather and Jay for this helpful discussion and learning experience. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye, folks.